get started. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank our speakers for coming so much. We have two speakers today. We have Dr. Ross, and we also have Peter Hylton. You probably don't know this, Catherine.
Okay.
This is the first time I've ever seen you speak. How many years have we known each other? I've never got 20.
100.
Have you seen one of mine? So I am excited about this. I have heard so much about your presentation. Dr. Ross is the Deputy Director for the National Center for Transportation Systems Performance and Management. Unpronounceable thing. I'm the director, so don't expect too much. She also directs the Center for Quality Growth and Regional Development. Big one. I'm going to skip stuff so we can move on. This is incredible. You have a book on mega regions and global competitiveness. You have an upcoming book on health impacts in the United States. You have research under just about everybody: NSF, USDOT, HUD, Ford Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency.
Which means I beg well.
I can't, this is amazing. You are 38 and you've done all of this.
Absolutely. That's the secret.
So we are really looking forward to this. I hope that was sufficient because you are all right.
Thank you.
Show.
So I want to take just a moment to tell you how we got into the area of research I'm going to talk about today, Peter and I. And it started quite accidentally 7 or 8 years ago when I got invited to the Rockefeller home up in Quantico, New York. They were sponsoring a seminar. They invited 15 people from the U.S., 15 people from Europe, to look at these population agglomerations. The University of Pennsylvania had done some work, and these 10 huge population economic centers popped up, and they had numbers, just population, and that was the end of the story. I was immediately suspicious because I'm at Georgia Tech. I went to Cornell, so I know the whole Northeast crowd a little bit. And usually I get the second phone call, not the first, but I got invited and I went. And they talked about what are we looking at spatially relative to the U.S. economy, and what does it mean not only for transportation but for our continued competitiveness. So being from Georgia Tech, we look at the population numbers and we say, well, what else does it mean? I come back. I say to my dean, I'm going to change my course in the spring. We're going to look at this super cities, as they were calling it back then. And I want to change my class agenda, my curriculum to include that. He said, fine. I said, and I want to take my class to Spain. He said, not happening. That part of it was not going to be the case. Anyhow, long story short, we did manage to set up a competitive situation where we took our spring class over. I actually ended up going to Spain. UPenn brought a class. We exchanged instructors with Spanish instructors and did a comparison on what the huge economic engines were in Spain and in the U.S. That started us on this track of what now we call mega regions. So we have been, since then, developing and building a database. It's the most expensive in the country, largely funded by the Federal Highway Administration for about 7 or 8 years now. Really trying to build the mapping and a database that helps us figure out two things that I think we still don't have very good answers to, which is what happens to this global economy relative to our transportation investment, relative to our economic competitiveness, and more importantly, how do we have a framework to address that investment? So today we'll look at, and I'm going to run through this because I really do want to leave some time for questions. That's how I learned a lot when we do that. But I do want to give you enough of a background so you kind of know what it is we're doing, why we think it's important, and why I think we've been successful in having a very long-term funding cycle with the U.S. Department of Transportation, about which we remain very excited. So we'll look at what are mega regions, why are they important. We actually done a survey nationally, which Peter will talk about, that really documents this, I think, in terms of the practice, rather than just the theoretical, which we at our institutions like to do a lot of thinking about. We'll look at the DOT and MPO preferences, and then take a quick look ahead. with regard to the future. So what are mega regions? We have developed a simple diagram to really explain a very complex phenomenon. Hope it's not my fault, I'm sure it's not. An economic phenomenon and a spatial phenomenon, this idea of mega regions. And it's real simple. When we first decided to figure out where these places were, we looked at major connected cities. Where do you live? Where do you work? What water resources do you share? What are your cultural amenities? What are your economic interactions? Where does freight play in terms of where it begins and where it ends? So we really developed a whole lot of activities, and then came with these 10 places that were more extensive than almost any other set of places in the U.S. relative to a set of characteristics. Subsequent to that, we tried to figure out how do we begin to explain this. Spatially, we came up with a very simple diagram here, which argues that mega regions measure centrality, the idea of connected places, interaction, economic, spatial, obviously transportation systems, that there's a functional relationship between them, and that they influence areas between them. So if we look from Atlanta to Birmingham, those are two major connected cities, but there's a lot in between that also is very much affected by what happens in those two ends. So we set about developing a theoretical construct, if you will. So we talk about economic interaction, geographic proximity, which is an issue, but not as much an issue as you might think with regard to driving economic activity, largely because of something we call logistics and information technology, et cetera, et cetera. And then the social, cultural, and environmental characteristics. So why are they important? This is the best map on mega regions. I can say that. It's the one the Federal Highway Administration is using. They're about to launch their mega regions website, and this will basically be the database that will drive it. You see 10 mega regions. We are located in the Piedmont Atlantic mega regions. And we ask, why do they matter? And the graphic you're looking at on the left attempts to give you some sense of their significance. They're very small, 30% of the population of the land area, almost 80% of the population, they explain. Fortune 500 companies, 92%. And really important, all the patents and innovation really reside in these 10 agglomerated areas. So you begin to see that when you talk about them spatially and sum them up, they explain a lot of what our economic activity is in the United States. The other point that I would make is if I talk about the Piedmont Atlantic mega regions, which is where we're located, we talk about the 5 states. We actually have a very large area. You can see the states that are included there. Think about those as a huge connected economic engine, which is what they are, and that's how the global world sees us. They drive down to look at Atlanta, but they also drive down to look at this region. And they talk about it with regard to investments that they're going to make, where they're going to come, where they're going to depart from. And so it's a whole new framework. We're arguing, it's one of the few views that we have about this whole global economy and how it might impact planning and transportation investment for us in the U.S. So we wanted to touch on for just a moment some of the issues that are driving this. The idea of declining transportation funding, and I'm not going to talk a lot about these, I just want to touch on them so you have some idea of the kinds of issues that can get addressed under this framework. Projected congestion, we know that that is something that's going to be with us. We're chipping away at it, but it is ever present. Freight movement changes, the whole logistics. In fact, I've got to share this with you, I got all excited. All the money that we're spending, and Peter was involved in this, looking at dredging the Savannah port so it's deep enough so that Panamax ships with the Panama Canal is finished its deepening activity, we'll be able to accommodate those. And we were talking, a number of us, including Tim the other day, and he made the observation that one of the technologies that they're looking at now is called the mobile harbor. And it says if you can't get the ship into the port, why don't you take the port to the ship? Well, that technology is not exactly in practice now, but it's very close. It's been tested in South Korea. That means that players and non-players take the port of Jacksonville, which is really small. If that kind of technology becomes readily available, there are players. It's not just being the biggest port anymore. It means you don't have to worry about deepening. Maybe there's some other opportunities. The point here is that technology will begin to impact even more what our global opportunities are going to be, what our national opportunities are going to be. Think about something called a mobile harbor. You know, the $1 billion we're going to spend before it's over deepening Savannah. Well, you know, what if it happens in 6 years? It's a fraction of the cost. Just your radar. Performance orientation, MAP 21, we are involved actively in a research project with regard to the new mandate for legislation for transportation, which talks about performance metrics, and we expect that too will be with us for a while. Climate change, political gridlock, something we never suffer from here in Georgia. And then aging infrastructure, and then of course safety. If you look at just the southeastern region, the Piedmont Atlantic mega region, we are so heavily reliant on truck activity, much more than other parts of the U.S. where they have more commodities being moved by rail. I think what's like 80%, 80+% of all of our freight moves by truck. And so if you look at 2007 truck volumes, and you look at 2040 truck volumes, you begin to see that freight and commodity movement will continue to be an increasing challenge for us. Of course, we are also pipeline poor. You look at where pipelines hit in this country, it's not the southeast, that's not where they're the most extensive. So for lots of reasons, this issue of freight and commodity movement is one that has to be on our trajectory. Why they matter, I've referenced some of this, planning tools for the global economy, spill over traditional metropolitan boundaries, whole idea of the economic base. We think of our economy as 150, 150, 150, 150. That's how we think about it, right? Everybody has their little pot. Well, in the global economy, we got to aggregate. Otherwise, your 150 isn't sufficiently significant. And so the idea of the economic activities, spill over metropolitan boundaries, the kind of interactions we're seeing, all mega regions, at least the conversations we're having. One of the things that they allow you to do is to diversify your economy. So you could have a mega region where we would have IT technology in Atlanta and another industry or growth industries in Birmingham, all part of the same mega region with an opportunity to plan more collectively and still allowing that differentiation, as well as creating opportunities for places that are between those who have to reinvent themselves. And Chattanooga is a great example. It's touted all over. Chattanooga has gone from being a place you wouldn't stop to fill up your car even if it was free. It's not very nice about 18 or 20 years ago. It's transformed itself not so much, and it certainly has in terms of the quality of life, but its economic base is now driven much more by derivatives. It actually buys from overseas manufacturers in Chattanooga, which has created quite a very nice situation with regard to opportunities and salary. So that's the kind of competition that we're in now, and that's the kind of analysis we have to have to stay competitive. So this idea of diversified agglomeration economies is a part of it. Scalable from rural to urban. One of the proposals which we have on the table, which may or may not be funded, is to look at what is the impact of freight on rural communities that it cuts across. Where it starts and where it goes. What are we doing to those places that are actually located between? Network economies. We've talked a lot about sort of network systems, and the real truth of the matter is, if those 10 places we showed you shut down, we don't work. I just told you why. 80 to 90% of all of our economics. So if they don't work, they're too congested, you can't get there, for a variety of reasons, we don't work. So the idea then that network economies focusing on those huge economic engines to make sure not only that they work, but they work well because they're our competitive advantage, has to be a part of how we look at transportation planning on an ongoing basis. And obviously this whole idea of global competitiveness and the rising ascendancy of gateways once again. Think about the logistics that are going to happen with the Panama Canal being deepening there. You know, you should all go to the West Coast, you can come to the East Coast. So all of that change, it means the game is changing, and so must we. How we do investments, how we think about transportation decisions, has to have another layer that's responsible and responsive to, should I say, what's happening all around us. So I would offer that ideas for you to think about. So this is our more glamorous notion of the mega region map that FHWA will be launching, I guess, here pretty soon now. We have done a lot of work on it. And what it does is to begin to say, this is at least one layer around which we begin to think about transportation investments and making sure, as I suggested, these places work. We go from Cascadia, there's really kind of the Piedmont Atlantic mega region was actually named by Georgia Tech, one of the classes that I taught, and we had some really bad names. Really, that just came out. Suggestion among students in the class, and we sort of, for obvious reasons, settled on the Piedmont Atlantic Mega region. So about 3 years ago, I got a call and went over to Beijing University to talk, and they wanted to talk about the Piedmont Atlantic Mega region, which got born at Georgia Tech. That our students had a real so this spatial map is kind of how most of our analysis works right now. Let me tell you about some people who are a bit ahead in terms of the kinds of planning that they're doing. And these are just examples of sort of interjurisdictional kinds of planning activities that fit nicely under the mega region map. And some of those are obvious. The whole Michigan, Canadian connection, the California Mexicans were sort of internationals. Of course, the Piedmont Alliance for Quality Growth, which I'll reference here, got started 5 years ago when the counties, the states in the southeast said, look, Interstate 85 touches a lot of states. So if you do improvements, we all benefit. So you have the mayors of cities in North Carolina calling USDOT to lobby for improvements in Georgia. What a radical idea. Why? Because the I-85 corridor, the 75 corridor, or the 20 corridor are all areas of congestion and concern. So they got together, primarily the private sector, universities were part of that, and mayors, elected officials, and said, we're going to focus on implementation, we're going to focus on generating more transportation resources for the Southeast mega region, we're going to support each other. A radical idea by all historical standards. And there are other examples, as I suggested. One idea that I've pushed that has not gotten much traction, but I'll mention it anyway, is the idea that we ought to have express corridors, that those 10 areas ought to have network systems that allow us to assume a certain level of efficiency with removing commodities through them. That ought to be something we ought to target and to make money available for because it's important. I tried to sell it a couple times. I try all the time, and it's a little bit of traction on that. I was just telling Mike, I was excited. The Undersecretary for Policy for Transportation will be here on November 6th. We're excited about that. We just found out yesterday. For a conference that's going to look at mega regions, freight, commodity planning in the private sector. Very radical, you know, bringing the Home Depots, the UPSs, the chambers all at the table with providers, GDOT, DOTs in the southeastern mega region, as well as MPOs, to have a joint conversation about how what's the role of the private sector, because they have more money than we do. We don't have any hardly. And so the idea of bringing them, so we're really excited about that, and we'll be hearing more about that. We just got that notice on yesterday. But I think it signals us as a place that they're very interested in. I have to leave the time. I got it. I'll move quickly now. You all know we have a Georgia statewide freight and logistics plan. The Federal Highway Administration really likes the work that our GDOT has done. They've done on that, so they're really touting our plan as one of those that everybody ought to look at. And I think that's a part of why they have decided to fund this peer exchange here on freight in the Southeast. Okay, I think with that, I'm going to stop. We conducted a survey, and I'm going to have Peter tell you a little bit about that, and then I'll come back and leave some time for questions.
Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to go over just some results that we did from a survey last year. This was late fall 2012 that we did a survey as part of the program that Dr. Ross was mentioning earlier, the Architecture of the Mega Region, which was a multi-year project that the Center for Quality Growth and Regional Development worked on. And this survey went out to all metropolitan planning organizations and DOTs, and was really trying to establish a baseline in terms of the projects, the geographies, the decision-making, and the funding and financing, what current practice is generally, and what MPO and DOT preferences are, and how it relates to mega regions. So it had about over 30 questions, a lot of them pre-response, a lot of analysis, and we'll just take a few of those spots and go over them, but if there's anything else that comes up in questions, please feel free to ask. Like I said, it went out to, so there are 384 MPOs. It went out to all of those MPOs, and we got responses from nearly half of them, so we were pretty happy about that. And for DOTs, it went out to all the DOTs in the areas where these MPOs are, so that's the 50 states and Puerto Rico, and we got about a 43% response rate. Response rates vary a little bit by question, but that's the overall. So just real fast, how we'll go through this is we'll look at the geography, then we'll go into the decision-making aspects, And then finally, we'll round it off with funding and financing, after all, draw some implications. So one of the things that we asked to get a baseline of the sorts of planning that are going on today is we asked MPOs and DOTs, are you involved in a sort of planning framework that crosses your planning boundaries? Are you involved in some sort of regular planning group with organizations outside your boundaries? And what we found was that 69% of them, a fairly high number, said that they were. It's a little lower for non-mega regions, 62%. And there was a lot of variety within the mega regions too. You see up to 100% in Cascadia. Piedmont, Atlantic, and Florida were also both very high. It varied a lot. Most of them were somewhat above the non-mega region level. One other thing to look at here, and I'll bring this out on the next slide, is that you do have a lot of institutional knowledge with these sorts of working groups and planning groups in different mega regions. The Midwest is has the most MPOs, the most DOTs. So even, if 72% say that they are involved in some sort of group like this today, that's a lot of institutional knowledge in that mega region about planning across boundaries, really, which is one of the key things on mega regions. So if you look at those same numbers slightly differently, you get, off on the right you have the non-mega region, and then for each of these others you have the mega region in terms of the percentage that reported being involved in this sort of regular planning and working group. Another interesting thing is to pull out the sorts of organizations that they deal with in these groups, or that they need to cooperate with outside of their boundaries. Some of them are not too surprising. They're dictated really by the federal planning process, so state UTs, federal agencies, MPOs in the same state. You see, that's part of the sort of state-centric transportation planning process that exists today. But one other thing, or a couple other things that are worth pointing out is the private sector involvement, very high among DOTs and MPOs, which touch on later in terms of what they envision, how they envision the private sector being involved in mega region planning. And then also you start to get planning spilling over into other states, crossing state boundaries. That happens particularly with the DOTs. If you look at DOTs that work with MPOs in adjacent state, well over half of them do, 64 or 5% roughly of them do. And a lot of MPOs, especially the large MPOs, are crossing state boundaries to do that. Also, you look at the MPOs and DOTs working with planning agencies in other countries. Almost a quarter of DOTs are working in some form or fashion with planning agencies in other countries. And again, some of the large MPOs and the larger MPOs, you think of Sandag, you think of ones around Detroit, ones where that border really isn't the most relevant thing for them. Crossing that border is really important. That matters a lot. And this isn't too surprising when you look at the sorts of issues that draw these organizations to larger framework than their own jurisdictions. These are some things that they reported, and it's very consistent among DOTs and MPOs as things that make them work outside their boundaries. And those top four especially stand out. And these are all things that can drive the mega region's approach. Environmental protection, one I'd like to point out just because so many of those things, they don't pay attention to county, state, city lines. And congestion, economic development, as Dr. Walsh was mentioning with Chattanooga and other things, it ties right in. So that's one of those things there. So to switch it a little bit from geography to the decision-making processes that happen right now in larger scale, mega region scale planning, it's a crowded field. There are a lot of actors that are involved in that. DOTs and MPOs on the left-hand side, they're both great. DOTs, MPOs, groups of MPOs, councils of government, elected officials, municipal governments, all sorts of actors as being involved in that. And when we asked them other specific questions where they could fill in a free response, that same thing came out too, that there are a lot of agencies working in this field that are trying to have influence over this. But another thing that we found is that it's really state-centric at this point. So on the right-hand side, you see that state DOTs are reported as being most often the leaders in this sort of mega region or multi-jurisdictional planning process. State DOTs themselves perceive that in almost all cases, over 85% of the cases, MPOs are more likely to see MPO groupings, MPO alliances as the leaders in that, which I think is interesting, the different dynamic there. But it really is a state-centric process. That came out in a variety of ways. The fact that states are leading MEG region planning as it exists today. And it should be noted that it's really individual states as opposed to groupings of states, which might be something that can be addressed in the future, considering that most MEG regions span more than one state. Not all of them, but the majority. Switch to one other thing, which is funding and financing. In short, funding is a major challenge. I don't think that will surprise anyone. But when you ask what the biggest obstacles are to implementing MEG region planning, funding and financing comes up by MEG regions and DOTs in multiple questions as the number one. And when you look on the left-hand side, it really makes sense because there's been stagnation in terms of the funding opportunities that MPOs and DOTs have. It's discussed a lot, the need for innovative funding and financing, and that is really important, but it hasn't all connected with them yet. 75% or 72% of MPOs say that they've not seen any improvement in their funding or financing tools over the last 5 years, and about half of DOTs, so it's hit MPOs harder apparently than DOTs, but it's something that they see needing to be addressed for the MEG region framework to go into effect. So one last thing that I'll pull out really quickly is that we also asked a bit about the sort of framework that MPOs and DOTs would envision for MEG region planning, and I won't go too much into that, but it mirrored some of the aspects of what we saw empirically is happening today in terms of a lot of different actors being involved in project function or corridor-based initiatives, and really a sort of flat governance structure that takes into account a lot of different, that includes all different actors. So I think some of these things have a lot of interesting implications going forward, and we'd be happy to talk more about questions.
And actually that question here, we just scratched the surface. There's a tremendous amount of information that we have really not shared with you today, but just to give you a flavor of it. And so in terms of implications, we've talked about the size and scope, importance of existing partners, if you will, robust revenue streams, just an idea of some of the things that mega regions can begin to speak to that were identified as challenges or opportunities in our survey thus far. One of the things is called multiplicity of approaches. It seems to me there's no one scheme, we have to figure this out. But what's interesting about it is we at least have a structure within which we can have a discussion about what this means from a global perspective in a number of ways. That was kind of one of our meetings. So if we take a quick look ahead and then leave some time for questions, we've spent 3.5 years looking at sort of what would be the architecture of the mega region from a number of perspectives, including doing this survey. We just found out we'll have another 1.5 years starting in October to do a test case. So what we've done is we're doing 2 modeling projects using the same software in Birmingham and Atlanta. So it'll be travel demand forecasting across borders, across states, same software. We're using data pulled from trucks, ATRI, GPS-based data. And so we'll really have a story to tell about how you begin to make this work from an operational sense. And that's the project that will be imminent in phase 2. To look at how do you create this architecture of the mega region, what works from a planning perspective and operations perspective, and really from a truck perspective. So we'll have all of that data made available to us. We can bring it to this project. It's actually funded under other projects, but we'll be able to bring it into the architecture of the mega region. And so one of those is the statewide and regional travel demand forecasting, which I've talked about. That is in process. We anticipate completing that by next year, middle next year, and we'll have all that good information to fuel our upcoming projects, and we have quite a few of those. The other looks at, as I suggested, the Panamax and the import on 3 other ports on the eastern seaboard, and their competitors in Savannah, that's New Orleans and New Orleans, Norfolk, and Savannah. Those 3, we started off trying to look at which was the other port. We didn't have Miami, and we didn't have enough information on that, so we've actually now added New Orleans. But we'll be comparing truck activity. We'll have GPS-based data for all of those, and of course, in the case of Alabama, we'll have some modeling results we can test as well. This is a project also that's ongoing, and GDOT just decided to give us some more money just to buy data so we could develop a nationwide truck framework. Sort of take what we've done on the eastern seaboard and duplicate that nationally, but do it at a more aggregate level. Because we'll have very specific data for our region, not as specific on a going forward basis. So that's sort of the connected work that's going on now. And I guess with that, we'll have some time for questions. Don't everybody just jump right in there.
So on one of your early slides, I guess the one that you said was the mega region map that the Federal Highway Administration is going to be.
Yeah.
It looked like the sort of the spatial unit with the mega regions were groupings of counties. And I'm wondering, it seems like some of the measures for what may constitute a mega region would conform to political boundaries and some wouldn't. And so how do you reconcile the two when you're defining a mega region?
So we did it economically. We started with just a blue slate 7 or 8 years ago. We just built databases on it to really see where these circles should go. We assumed, we made not many assumptions, except we of course know that many of these are centered around cities that are connected as well. If you look at, for example, the Northeast with New York, Philadelphia, we knew that. But we started by just sort of building the database up across a whole lot of parameters. And that began to give us our spatial structure and our interaction piece of it. And so it started from a disaggregate level. We aggregated it up to define spatially and economically what they should look like. That's the result of those. And so what you have now is a spatial structure that knits counties together, right? And states really are the largest extended regional structures, and then states, some of which, as you know, traverse different states. But the point that I'm trying to make is, so the rationalization part of it is what our architecture of the mega region, because we've got what, in the southeast and Piedmont Atlantic mega region, we have 5,000 political jurisdictions. 5,000? And so how do you have any sort of cohesiveness? I think there's no answer to that. This architecture of the mega region, I think, will begin to let us peel away at that a bit. But the challenge we have now is, how do you make all of that work? What we have been focused on is, what is that? What does it look like? How can we begin to test it and probe it in terms of economics? And we focused on commodity and freight because that's a big issue for us all over, but particularly in the Southeast. So we sort of set for ourselves a lofty charge. I think one we've had some success at, but I think the question you're asking, in terms of how you rationalize it, is a question that the government and all of us are going to have to grapple with. I wish I had the good answer. Well, look in Georgia, right? The counties that we have, how well we're doing in that regard.
I also have a question about the FHA map. I noticed that there were a couple of smaller peripheral cities that looked like they could have gone in one or another mega region.
Right.
Like, I'm originally from Rochester, New York, and different maps I have seen on this concept have placed it in different mega regions.
Yeah, they don't have any numbers under theirs.
Okay. I was wondering though if there was like, some of those cities did have interactions with 2 or more mega regions data.
Absolutely. And I don't want you to think this is not the definitive map. I would never make that argument. It's only an attempt for us to deliver a framework that resonates with the global economy, resonates with our next big decisions on transportation investment policy. Take a look at the freight and commodity flow issue. That gives us a reference point, because right now, after this, we don't have a place to have a conversation. Everybody stops at Georgia, or the MPO for the Atlanta region, or DeKalb County Commission, or the Mount Perry Neighborhood Association where I live. That's how our world works now. But the world has changed, and we have to begin to think about how we're going to have good answers in this new spatial configuration and economics. So this is not the definitive map. And could one of those places go in another mega region? Absolutely. And if you have more money and more time, you can do it better. All of that is yes, yes, yes. But let me tell you an experience I had. I did something I haven't done in 20-some years. I gave a lecture at the University of Georgia on a Sunday morning. The things I do for Georgia Tech. And I went, and a woman stood up and she said, "Oh, Catherine, your map," she said, "I live in Nebraska. I don't give a whippy about a mega region. It doesn't touch my life. I just think it's ridiculous." And I said, "You live in Nebraska?" She said, "Yes." And I said, and do you have one or more interstates that you use, and they're close to you? She said, yes. I said, guess what? They didn't start there. We didn't start building our interstate system in Nebraska, I can assure you. But over time, but over time, we in fact have expanded it so that there's a great benefit from that kind of investment, having the most extensive interstate system in the world. So I think what we're saying here is where you land first is not so much the issue. Do we need to be having this conversation? Do we need a structural geography, a financing, a mobility framework? The answer is yes. And we are making no claims except we're scratching the surface, and it's beginning to resonate. I will say that. I would never have thought 7 years ago we would have been as far along as we are, or that we would have had USDOT support for as long as we have. So I think they too see that we have to have some other ways to have conversations about what it is. So absolutely, either one of those could belong almost anywhere else. We think from the work that we've done, this is a good representation. Yes, sir.
So has the concept been applied in other countries anywhere nearly extensively, and and more specifically, how does it play out in, let's take some Southeast Asian areas, for example, where we think the density is so high that is the mega region,
Beijing is a mega region,
or something?
Shanghai is a mega region, and what is the EU? How did the EU develop their whole geography, footprint, and transportation investment strategy? All along the framework of mega regions. What are those regions we know are going to not do well? We're not going to put our money there. What are the ones that we think are going to do well? Where should we make our transportation investment? All of it, when they talked about the EU some years ago, I just laughed. I thought, oh, that's just ridiculous. Then about 6 years ago, I went and I got to compare their money to ours. The internationals changed there, and they looked a little more competitive than I would have hoped, to say the least. So all I'm arguing is that what we're talking about now is being applied globally and has been for a while. Europe, great example. Asia, a great example. So I think we're tracking correctly. And there's lots of evidence that people are, in some instances, ahead of us with this concept, but going in the same direction.
It seems like much of the research is focused around freight, but I wonder if you might be willing to speak just a little bit about the implications these mega regions might have for passenger transportation.
Well, one of the things that we thought about is if I started with these 10 don't work, we don't work. And so how do you have more capacity when you don't have more money? So one of the ways, and how do you free at least some of the economic activities that we know we have to conduct. So one of the issues is to sort of look at this freight, I think, in commodity, when we have some better sense of that. But the other side of it is how do we make investments in passenger transportation that allows us to use our existing investments more efficiently. So I think the implications are that these are also places where we should look at transit investment, if you will. That if we look at high-speed rail, these ought to be some of the places we ought to look first, because they give us added capacity by adding more people, as you know, by conveyance systems and all of us are driving along, if you will. So there's no doubt that the role of public transportation is critical, I think, in making these economic engines work. No doubt about it. Dr. Hunter.
I'll ask you these one, I promise.
Oh, that's because I'll get you back if you don't.
Seems like funding is a big issue in all of this that came up in your survey. If you had if you could wave your magic wand and people actually did whatever you said. Like, because I always do whatever you tell me to do.
Oh,
right?
Don't leave that.
So, what would you do? What is the solution to this funding problem?
I would mandate mega region planning as one of the levels in which we would look at transportation investment decisions, economic development decisions, the role that the federal government would play. I would prioritize certain kinds of investments as being critical, and I think commodity flow is an important one, and figure out how we get money to nurture that along. I would work on creating corridors that are connected, a swatch in some places. I know you people, I'm not trying to ruin the environment, I promise you. We can protect that. So we have sort of a network system, and we kind of have a better sense. Right now it's happenstance for what could end up where at a particular place where it needed to be, just making sure it works a bit more efficiently. And I have an ongoing conversation. We have no national perspective on our transportation. We have no national policy. None. Just, you know, it happens what happens. The world is so competitive now, we've got to be more strategic than we are. It's not happenstance anymore. It's targeted strategy. That's flexible, because you know it changes, you can get it wrong. I'm not arguing that we have to know it all. But I think it's a discussion. I was at the White House like 3 or 4 years ago, and I took the book and I took all these things to the president, and so when he got to talking, I gave it to him. And I said, here, you should read this. Of course, he handed it to someone else. But the point that I made was, you need to talk about a national policy of sorts. What are our priorities? Is everything equally important like we're treating it? Is not. And that's a hard conversation to have. Because we're all used to, you know, everybody gets to their 150, 150, 150, which is a foolish strategy in terms of transportation investment in a global market. It just is silly. So that's what I would do. Even if we could engage the conversation, that would be great. Right now, it's not where it needs to be. And it's not where our competitors are, I can assure you.
I do believe there's a class waiting to get in at 1. That's right.
Well, thank you all for coming. We enjoyed that.
I didn't bring my receipt.